Imagine a leader who rose from a tent in the desert to the palaces of power, who challenged the world's strongest nations, reshaped his country overnight, and died in the dust of the same land that raised him. Was he a hero or a tyrant? This is the story of Muammar Gaddafi, and it's not what you think. Muammar Gaddafi was born in June 1942, near the coastal city of Sirte, Libya, to a Bedouin family from the Gaddafi tribe. He grew up in a simple, traditional tent, herding camels and sheep in a region still marked by the scars of Italian colonization. Libya at that time was a monarchy under King Idris, and the young Gaddafi developed a deep resentment toward both foreign influence and domestic inequality. Educated in local schools, he was influenced by Arab nationalist leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gaddafi saw in Nasser a model of resistance to colonial powers, and he dreamed of uniting the Arab world. By the time he entered the Libyan military academy in Benghazi, his political ideas were already formed, and they were radical for a country still clinging to monarchy. On September 1, 1969, at just 27 years old, Gaddafi led a bloodless coup against King Idris while the monarch was abroad for medical treatment. The coup was swift and precise with almost no resistance. Libya was declared a republic, and Gaddafi emerged as its de facto leader. In those early days he spoke the language of liberation. He promised to end corruption, share the nation's oil wealth with its people, and stand against Western domination. His charisma was undeniable, both to those who saw him as a liberator and to those who would later call him dangerous. Before we go further into this remarkable and controversial journey, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This story is one of power, vision, and downfall, and by the end you might see Gaddafi in a way you never have before. Because the boy who once played barefoot in the sands of Sirte would go on to rule for over 4 decades, building dreams for some, nightmares for others, and leaving behind a legacy the world is still debating today. When Gaddafi seized power in 1969, Libya was a sparsely populated desert nation with vast oil reserves but little development. The monarchy had kept much of the oil revenue in elite circles, and ordinary Libyans saw little benefit. Gaddafi's first years in power moved quickly to change that. He expelled foreign military bases, most notably American and British installations, positioning himself as a defender of Libyan sovereignty. He nationalized the oil industry, forcing international companies to renegotiate contracts on far more favorable terms for Libya. Oil profits surged, and Gaddafi pledged they would be used to improve the lives of ordinary citizens. In many ways he delivered on that promise. Education and healthcare became free. Illiteracy rates dropped sharply as schools were built across the country. Housing projects aimed to provide shelter for the poor. Perhaps his most ambitious domestic project was the Great Man-Made River, a massive engineering effort to bring underground water from the Sahara to coastal cities, an undertaking he called the eighth wonder of the world. In 1975 he published the Green Book, laying out his political philosophy. It rejected both capitalism and communism, promoting what he called the Third International Theory, a mix of socialism, Islam, and tribal democracy. He envisioned Libya as a state of the masses, where direct popular committees would replace parliaments and political parties, which he viewed as corrupt. Outside Libya, Gaddafi positioned himself as a leader of the Arab nationalist movement. He championed pan-Arab unity, attempting unions with countries like Egypt, Syria, and Tunisia, though these alliances never lasted. By the 1980s, his focus shifted toward Pan-Africanism, promoting continental unity and independence from Western influence. To some, Gaddafi was a revolutionary hero, a leader who stood against imperialism and invested in his people. To others, he was building a personality cult, concentrating power in his own hands while silencing political opposition. What is certain is that Gaddafi's Libya, by the late 1970s, had transformed from a quiet monarchy into one of the most politically assertive and economically independent states in the region. But his boldness would soon put him on a collision course with the most powerful nations in the world. By the late 1970s, Gaddafi's foreign policy and rhetoric had drawn sharp attention, and growing hostility from Western powers. He openly supported liberation movements and armed groups across Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe. Gaddafi saw this as aiding the fight against colonialism and oppression. His critics saw it as state-sponsored terrorism. Relations with the United States soured rapidly. In 1979, after protesters attacked and burned the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, Washington officially listed Libya as a state sponsor of terrorism. The tensions only escalated in the 1980s. 2 incidents became defining moments. The first came in 1986, when U.S. President Ronald Reagan accused Libya of orchestrating the bombing of a West Berlin discotheque that killed 3 people, including 2 American soldiers. 10 days later, the U.S. launched Operation El Dorado Canyon, airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi. One of Gaddafi's homes was hit, killing his adopted daughter Hannah. Gaddafi survived, but his anti-American stance hardened. The second, and most infamous, was the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Scotland, killing 270 people. After years of investigation, Western intelligence agencies accused Libyan agents of planting the bomb. Gaddafi's government initially denied involvement, but in 2003, Libya accepted responsibility for the actions of its officials and agreed to pay compensation to victims' families, while still claiming it had not ordered the attack. In between, there were other incidents, such as the 1989 bombing of UTA Flight 772 over Niger, also blamed on Libyan operatives, that deepened Libya's isolation. The United Nations imposed sanctions in the 1990s, restricting air travel, arms sales, and certain imports. For nearly a decade, Libya's economy and diplomatic ties suffered. Yet, Gaddafi maintained his defiance. He continued to present himself as a revolutionary standing against Western imperialism, using the sanctions as proof that the West feared an independent Libya. Inside the country, his control over politics and media tightened. By the end of the 1990s, Gaddafi faced a choice: remain a pariah or re-enter the global system. What followed would be one of the most surprising turns in his political career, a transformation from mad dog in the West's eyes to a temporary partner. By the late 1990s, decades of sanctions and isolation had strained Libya's economy and international standing. Gaddafi, ever the political survivor, began a calculated shift. The turning point came in 1999, when Libya handed over 2 intelligence officers for trial in the Lockerbie bombing case. This gesture opened the door to renewed dialogue with the West. In 2003, Libya formally accepted responsibility for the actions of its officials in the Lockerbie attack and agreed to pay $2.7 billion in compensation to victims' families. That same year, Gaddafi announced Libya would dismantle its weapons of mass destruction programs and allow international inspectors in, a move welcomed by the US and UK. The sanctions were lifted, and Gaddafi was suddenly back on the global stage. The shift was striking. In the early 2000s, Western leaders who once condemned him now shook his hand. Gaddafi visited European capitals, met with African and Western leaders, and even addressed the United Nations in 2009 with a famously long and theatrical speech. Oil deals flowed again, particularly with European companies, and Libya's economy experienced a resurgence. At the same time, Gaddafi's focus on Africa intensified. He became a leading voice in the African Union, calling for a United States of Africa, with a single currency, military, and government. He invested billions in African infrastructure and communications, funding projects from hotels to airlines. But at home, the picture was more complex. While oil wealth improved infrastructure, unemployment remained high, and political freedoms were virtually non-existent. The People's Committees Gaddafi promoted as a form of direct democracy were seen by critics as tools to maintain his grip on power. Dissent was still punished, and human rights abuses continued to be reported by international organizations. Beneath the outward stability, discontent simmered, especially among younger Libyans who had grown up knowing only one leader. The Arab world was also changing. In Tunisia and Egypt, long-standing rulers were facing unprecedented protests. By 2011, those winds of change would reach Libya's shores. And when they did, Gaddafi's decades-long balancing act, between revolutionary, reformer, and ruler, would collapse in a matter of months. In early 2011, the Arab Spring swept across North Africa and the Middle East, toppling governments in Tunisia and Egypt. In Libya, protests began in February in the city of Benghazi, sparked by the arrest of a human rights lawyer. The grievances were familiar: high unemployment, lack of political freedom, and decades of Gaddafi's unchallenged rule. The demonstrations quickly escalated into an armed uprising. Rebels seized large parts of eastern Libya, while Gaddafi vowed to crush the revolt. In a televised speech, he called on his supporters to show no mercy to opponents, promising to cleanse the country house by house. The language only deepened international alarm. As fighting intensified, the United Nations authorized a no-fly zone to protect civilians. NATO forces, led by the US, UK, and France, began airstrikes against Gaddafi's military in March 2011. The strikes crippled his forces and allowed rebel groups to push westward toward Tripoli. By August, the capital fell to rebel control, and Gaddafi's whereabouts became uncertain. For weeks, he remained hidden, releasing audio messages urging Libyans to resist. His final refuge was in his hometown of Sirte, now under siege. On October 20, 2011, as rebel forces closed in, Gaddafi attempted to flee in a convoy but was struck by NATO aircraft. He was captured alive by fighters on the ground, beaten, and killed in chaotic scenes recorded on mobile phones. The images spread worldwide within hours, marking a brutal end to his 42-year rule. His death left Libya in a power vacuum. The institutions he had dismantled or controlled for decades were gone, and the country soon fell into political fragmentation and conflict, a turmoil that continues today. Muammar Gaddafi remains one of the most polarizing figures of the modern era. To some, he was a visionary who used oil wealth to transform Libya, resisted Western dominance, and dreamed of African unity. To others, he was a dictator who concentrated power, crushed dissent, and left his nation unprepared for a future without him. History rarely deals in absolutes. In Gaddafi's story, hero and villain often occupied the same space, and whether he is remembered as one or the other depends on where you stand.